We're live.
Thank you, Ms. Parvex. Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Exam Schools Admissions Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call a roll. Ms. Parvex, please.
Thank you, Mr. Condopasis. Mr. Acevedo,
Present.
Ms. Aguirre,
Present.
Mr. Chernow, Mr. Kreger,
Present.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom, Ms. Grassa,
Present.
Ms. Lam,
Present.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Present.
Ms. Garrett, Dr. Tang,
Present.
Ms. Wade, Ms. Sullivan, and Mr. Condopasis.
Present. We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cabo Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Arabic, Somali, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Our Spanish interpreter this evening is Luz Barreto Longas. Will you please invite our Spanish-speaking audience to switch their Zoom channel in Spanish?
Good afternoon. My name is Luz Barreto. I will be interpreting for you today. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Luz Barreto. Estaré interpretando en español hoy por la tarde. Para poder oír la interpretación, por favor, mire en la parte inferior de su pantalla que habrá un icono de un globo. Al tocarlo, encuentra diferentes idiomas y seleccione español. Si va a utilizar un teléfono celular, por favor, mire en la parte superior a la derecha, habrá 3 punticos. Al tocarlo, saldrá interpretación y busque el español. Gracias. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cabo Verdean interpreter is Josanne Lopes. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Cabo Verdean?
Thank you, Mr. Condopasis. Good evening, everyone. Boa tarde, meu nome é Josiane, se você é os intérpretes de crioulo para que reunião ali, para ter acesso à interpretação simultânea. Logo que está disponível, nos clica na ícone de globo na parte inferior do ecrã e seleciona Cabo Verdeano. Se você usa telemóvel, nos clica na 3 pontinhos na parte superior. Para qualquer dúvida, nos coloca na chat. Obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Portuguese interpreter is Christiane Leitner. Will you please give the Zoom instructions
Yes,
in
sir.
Portuguese?
Yes, good evening. Oi, boa noite. Eu sou a Cristiane, intérprete de português brasileiro. Se você precisa dessa reunião traduzida para português, assim que eles acionarem os canais, você vai ver um globo na parte inferior da tela. Você clica ali e escolhe o canal português. Se você estiver assistindo essa reunião por um telefone, você vai ver no canto superior direito 3 pontos, você clica ali e escolhe o canal português. Qualquer dúvida, você pode colocar no chat. Obrigada.
Thank you. Our Vietnamese interpreter is V. Lee. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Vietnamese?
Good evening, everyone. My name is V. I will be your Vietnamese interpreter for tonight's meeting. Kính chào quý vị, tôi tên là Vi, tôi sẽ là thông dịch viên của quý vị ngày hôm nay. Xin quý vị nhìn vào màn hình, ở dưới có quả cầu và bấm vào tiếng Việt để có thể nghe được thông dịch viên nói chuyện. Cảm ơn rất nhiều. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter this evening is Terry Yin. Please give the Zoom instructions in Cantonese.
Thank you, Mr. Condopasis. 大家好，我名叫做 Terry， 我係你哋嘅廣東話翻譯。一陣咧，你喺屏幕下邊咧就會見到一個地球儀嘅圖標，你點下地球儀嘅圖標之後揀 Chinese， 你就可以入到廣東話嘅頻道啦。咁如果你用手機或者係用平板電腦，即係好似 iPad 咁樣嘅話咧，你就可以點下嗰3個點，咁之後咧再揀 Chinese， 亦都可以入到我哋嘅翻譯嘅頻道。OK， 唔該晒，一陣見 ，Thank you。
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Wei Li. Will you please give the Zoom instructions in Mandarin?
Thank you, sir. 大家好，我是你的普通话翻译伟。如果你需要普通话翻译的话呢，请你点击屏幕下方的地球仪，然后选择中文Mandarin 频道，然后就可以进入这个频道听我的翻译。如果是你用手机或者是平板电脑的话呢， 你可以点击这个3个点，然后呢可以进到这个翻译频道听我的翻译。好，祝大家晚上都愉快。Okay, back to you, sir.
Thank you. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint-Hilaire. Please give the Zoom instructions in Haitian Creole.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. C'est un plaisir encore pour nous avoir aujourd'hui pour nous interpréter pour en créole. Moi, Sergio, c'est moi qui ai interprété pour. Tout ça qu'on a besoin de c'est Tio et puis moi-même m'a interprété pour. Si vous besoin d'entrer dans la conversation, ou à cliquer en bas écran là, ou à faire un globe, ou à rentrer, ou à petit tout, soit capable d'entendre et puis ou à choisir français et c'est là que ou à nous n'a traduit pour. Nous souhaitons bonne écoute et nous disons merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Parvek, has our Somali interpreter arrived?
No, she hasn't joined yet.
Okay. Our Arabic interpreter is Ahmed Al-Rubaye. Please give the Zoom instructions in Arabic.
Thank you, sir. مرحبا، أنا اسمي أحمد الربيعي، أنا مترجم اللغة العربية لهذا اليوم. بإمكانكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية من خلال الذهاب إلى أسفل الشاشة. ستشاهدون علامة الكرة الأرضية. اضغط على هذه العلامة وستظهر لك اختيارات اللغات. قم باختيار اللغة العربية وعندها ستتمكن من الاستماع إلى الترجمة الفورية. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters, Christina Miranda and Nicole Sasson. Thank you all for assisting us this evening. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace to assist our interpreters. We don't have any minutes to approve today, and I don't believe, is Ms. Hogan on? Ms. Roberts?
Yes, I think Ms. Hogan is on.
I just want to make sure that we don't have any more data.
No, I don't
this
believe so.
evening. Okay,
No, we don't.
all righty. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this over then to Ms. Sullivan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Contemplasis. Okay, I'm gonna start as I did yesterday and say thank you in advance. We are getting down to the wire. We are literally 24 hours away from presenting or the start of presenting our recommendation to, oh wow, thunderstorms. Listen, God is watching. Literally, you know, just about 24 hours away from presenting this a final recommendation to the school committee relative to this process, and truly want to thank the entire task force, the interpreters. Some of you have been with us for really this entire journey. Thank you for being with us and providing us with support. We greatly appreciate that. Yes. And, you know, tonight, hopefully we will be able to stay within our 2 hours, but that's probably unlikely. So again, thank you in advance for this final conversation.
Ms. Sullivan, can I interrupt just for a moment?
Sure.
I'm sensitive to the fact that we had a question last night from Ms. Grassa, that if someone could put the things that the issues that we have consensus on, on a slide. And I'm not sure you had the time today, nor did I. And I'm not sure whether the folks in the city had any time to do it at the school department.
Oh, yes.
So well, I thought it might be a good idea that the members could take pen or pencil in hand, and we could at least, the two of us, hopefully come up with the list that we think we've agreed to.
So I was getting there, Mr. Contemplasis.
Oh, great. Okay.
Listen, My mother always said, a thank you is never too long or never too late. So, so we're getting the thank yous out of the way. But we're gonna dive into it for tonight and be prepared to come to a final decision as a group. That said, I actually think that, and Monica will let us know, one of them may have had the opportunity to put onto a slide where we left off last night. I will give them a moment. They'll indicate to us whether or not they were able to do that. If they did, I'll give them a moment to pull that to get it started. But, you know, as they're doing that, I want to, I want to put on the table, coming off of last night. Again, we suspended the meeting, so this is the continuation of last night's meeting. Coming off of last night's meeting, there has, you know, certainly been a swirl of feedback that we've received as a task force from various parts of the city, right? Various stakeholders, and you know, folks having, I think the good thing is folks had a really good sense of where we landed on last night. Monica, can you put in the chat, do you have a slide, or are you working on a slide, or should we do this orally? Or can you just say?
I think Monica Hogan has one.
Okay, awesome. Okay.
Give us a minute.
Okay, no problem. But we've received a lot of feedback, you know, just generally speaking about where we landed with respect to this, the 70-30, but even more so with respect to the 100% SES tiers straight rank. That has received feedback. And so I do want to be, again, of course, all of our meetings are subject to open meeting law. As task force members, it's important that, you know, all of our, you know, deliberations are in public. And so I do want to put on the table for folks, again, based on what we heard specifically about the 100% SES straight rank, I do want to put on the table for us an opportunity for folks to speak to that if they're so inclined. And before you do, does Monica Hogan have screen sharing capability, Lena?
Yes, she does.
Okay, perfect. Just a refresher on where I believe we landed last night. Monica?
It's saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
Just a second, I will. What about now?
Got it, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.
So I believe this should be the right slide. And if I miscaptured anything, happy to make adjustments.
So the only thing that's missing that I see is the, and I see Dr. Tung, I see your hand. What I do see missing is the specialized tier for DCF and homeless students, similar to the interim policy. Yeah. But otherwise, again, this is not inclusive of course, our expanded recommendations relative to BPS and the academics within BPS for the elementary grades. But yes, I think this is right. DCF, homeless, yeah. Dr. Tung.
And could you add a sub bullet under the first one about what assessment we've agreed?
Oh, yes, it's good. fifth grade or sixth grade, whichever is higher. Anything else we're missing from last night where we left off?
I would just add under the grade, it says first 2 terms of 6th grade, what they're going to do about the schools on trimesters. So is it just the first trimester?
Yeah,
Or is
that's a
it
good point.
first 2 quarters and first trimester, just to be clear?
Yeah. And how does that work for fifth grade?
I think we agreed to last 2 quarters of the spring in math and language arts.
Right, but is there a try?
I think in 5th grade, everyone is on trimesters.
Okay,
So you could do the last, it's currently we take, sorry, not this year, but previous years, it was always the last trimester of 5th grade, ELA and math.
Okay, great.
good.
Great. Okay, so is this right? Could, Monica Hogan, do you mind making this, putting this in presentation mode, please? Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right. Great. So Dr. Tung,
What about the grouping for students in BH?
yes, thank you. You're right. Great. Ms. Grasso?
I just would like to clarify, and I think this is for a Ms. Hogan question. If we're doing the map growth for 5th or 6th grade, I just know the benchmark in 5th grade is different than the benchmark in 6th grade. And is that going to cause issues?
I think this is a detail we definitely need to talk through with NWEA around what they recommend, but there are percentiles that correspond to the norms of where it would be considered quote unquote on grade level at different times of the year. So I think that norm would change based on what time period in 6th grade the test is given compared to 5th grade.
Thank you.
Mr. Chernow?
Are we also going to mention the part about how, like the order that, like which tiers pick first and how that, yeah.
Great. Ms. Aguirre?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the right time, but I think that at some point we will we will need to discuss, are we over inviting to the schools, or what happens if students are invited and they don't want to go? What happened to those seats?
My best thinking on this is that the schools will over-enroll as they have in the past.
But that was not a decision that was made yesterday.
Right.
Anything else that we might be missing? Dr. Tung?
We didn't decide last night, but to be decided is which tier option. we're using, 1, 5, or 6.
Mr. Chernow, is your hand still raised? Is that a lingering hand or a new hand? Okay. All right. Yes, the thunder, you can hear the thunder in the background. Okay. Okay. So this is where we left off last night. Let's give folks a moment. I think this is right. Great. So coming out of, as I shared at the beginning, there has been a lot of conversation, primarily about the mechanism, which is the 100% of invitations allocated by straight rank within the census tracts. Specifically, we have heard, you know, if you read the Boston Globe comments, especially, I try not to, but if you do, specifically, we've heard about, with respect to the 100% of invitations allocated by straight rank, really a desire to have, you know, an X percentage of students be able to access the seats on a citywide basis. So similar to our interim policy where we had the 20/80, right? Where we had 20% of the students, 20% of the seats allocated citywide, 80% of the seats allocated on the geographic measure. Specifically, what we have heard is really, again, that folks feel, which is, I guess, a good thing, that was a good aspect of the interim policy. You contrast that with what we saw with respect to the data. And, you know, thinking about our overall charge, not only to expand the pool of applicants, but also to achieve greater socioeconomic, geographic, and racial and ethnic diversity. When we look at the data is clear that the 20% does not help to improve any of those indicators. And yet and still, there are folks who feel strongly that there should be some set aside for students to access these seats citywide. So again, I want to just be transparent. I know we've received written testimony. Many of us have been reading the newspapers and reading other commentary. Some of us have, you know, heard directly from folks on this. So I want to put that on the table so that there can be an open discussion about it and get your reactions to it. Mr. Kreger.
So I'm processing this.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing I want to say is what I said last night, which is that if all these students are going to the same school, then the bus they're getting there on doesn't need to have a first class section and a coach section if they're all going to the same place. Okay, that's my belief in the dangers of an 80-20 split. Okay. That said, I think the value of an 80-20 split is that it allows us to further clarify for any court in which this plan can be challenged that your path to admission is fundamentally not tied to your race or any other identity. To those who have looked at our interim policy as the chance to say that neighborhood or socioeconomic status or anything else is merely a proxy for race, right? The 80-20 split is one way to make quite clear that that argument topples under its own weight. With that in mind, I can support applying an 80-20 split to our current proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Kreger. Mr. Acevedo, and then Dr. Tung.
I would agree with Mr. Kreger and Ms. Sullivan. I appreciate you bringing it back on the table. I was last night, in fact, I voted in favor of a 100% SES tiers, straight rank. Primarily because I wanted to be sure that anyone who doubted our commitment to equity we would vitiate any of those doubts. However, really checking my gut, I have actually a much more, I have a more visceral inclination to the 80-20 than even the 100% for a couple of reasons. Somehow we pulled off something perhaps unintentionally beautiful back in October. We did a lot of work on this, and frankly, we didn't know how any of this was going to hold up after the conversations that we had throughout the summer. But we ended up with something, let's put it this way. The perfect is always going to be the enemy of the best. But we came up with something really remarkable. We came up with a plan that, as Mr. Kreger said, not only is likely to dispel any fears of this being a backdoor to a racial set-aside, but has already survived a constitutional challenge. So the use of the 80-20 already has, the imprimatur from the Federal Appeals Court, number one. Number two, we're demonstrating that we can have our equity and our rigor too. And what we saw was that we made remarkable gains using the 80-20. We had remarkable gains at each of the demographic levels and with each of the ethnic representations, more Latinx students, more Black students into a Boston Latin school. And Ms. Garrett is correct, really, we're talking about per shop. And at the same time, we were able to dispel any concerns that we weren't about rigor and that we weren't about, respecting constitutional muster. I think it puts us in the safest ground to do something historic and that will endure and that is sustainable.
Dr. Tung.
Yes, the 20% citywide did move us towards our goal for this year. And we've seen plenty of data, as Ms. Sullivan points out, that we can do better. So why would we stop at good enough? And to Mr. Kreger's point, have there been any legal challenges to the use of tiers in Chicago? And if so, have they been successful? Because that's the main change that we're talking about here.
No, none that we're aware of, Dr. Tong. And the Chicago model, as was referenced, uses tiers plus a 70-30 split with 30% admission citywide and the remaining seats applied in tiers thereafter.
Ms. Garrett.
I think Mr. Kreger may have just answered. It was a clarifying question about Chicago along with Dr. Tong. So they do have a citywide set aside in Chicago. Is that correct, along with the tiers? So we don't have necessarily a model to compare using the same tier structure because they're not 100% in tiers. Or I'm just trying to. Is that so? What is Chicago's split, Mr. Kreger?
Chicago split is 30% citywide and the remaining 70% divided between 4 tiers.
Okay, thank you.
So I hear this. What I'm not hearing, and I'll just be frank, that is a little unsettling for me, is that like we're not acknowledging the data relative to the 20%. And the 20%, again, we've seen it over and over and over again. It's clear about what the 20% represents. And if we're going to present a recommendation, I do think it's important for us to wrestle with that. We have successfully wrestled with nearly every other issue that has been raised about the interim policy and, quite frankly, you know, the pre-pandemic policy. I'm not comfortable just doing 20%, knowing that 20% is really about high income, one neighborhood, and a certain racial demographic. How do we solve for that? Mr. Chernow?
Yeah, just pretty much adding on to everything that Ms. Sullivan just said. I mean, the data is extremely clear. Like, it's straight in our faces. It says exactly what Ms. Sullivan just said, that when you base it straight off citywide, the students with the most privilege are going to do the best. And we're trying to we're trying to answer our charge. I don't see how that answers our charge by including a 20% model to the most privileged students. And that's what the data shows that it is. So I would be very concerned with going back to the 20% model. I'm a little confused because it seemed like we had reached an agreement on the 100% rate yesterday. I think it's also, just to put that out there again, that no matter what we do, people are going to hate. There's going to be some group of people that are disliking what we're doing. Some people have louder voices than others, but you know, there's going to be some people that are always going to be mad at what we come up with. So we just got to balance out what are we willing to compromise and what are we willing to sacrifice versus what's going to get us to reach our charge.
Dr. Tong.
I'm just trying to understand and recap what happened last night, because I think what happened was we were wrestling with how much weight to give an assessment. And so when we landed at 70% GPA, 30% assessment, we sort of came to a compromise around the 20% citywide or 100% by socioeconomic grouping. So, and that was something that we all gave a little. and, you know, talked about for a long time. So I'm just wondering why we're revisiting.
Mr. Acevedo.
Perhaps to address that concern, Ms. Sullivan, I view it this way, and I appreciate getting clarity. Again, just a reminder from the Chicago model, where our 2080, well, let's put it this way. If we're doing a 2080 split, 20% citywide, 80% drawn from economic tiers, and putting 70% of the weight on grades and 30% on a workable exam, workable test, not the ISEE. We're going to be, this would be by definition, if we had introduced this in October of 2020, when we introduced something very similar to that, it should very rightly be celebrated as a mammoth achievement and the most equitable admissions policy to our exam schools. And really, particularly, we're talking about one, as Ms. Garrett brings up frequently, we're really just talking about her shop. The question then becomes, okay, it's almost a statistical sleight of hand. The concern is you're looking specifically at the 20% and pulling the data from the limited universe of the 20% and saying, my goodness, this looks like the battle days. And it does. But the heavy lifting is happening in the 80%. I think there's a good reason why Chicago is permitting a 30% citywide set aside and a 70% drawn from from 4 tiers. The reason for that, and let's just speak to adults. That 20% is what's giving us permission to do the 80%.
So I disagree
and
with
when
you.
May I just finish?
Yeah,
my
but
statement?
I also want to be mindful that everyone needs to be given an opportunity to speak too.
All right.
Mhm.
Okay. I don't think I'm alone in that. I want the students, in other words, my concern is we have the opportunity, and I'll repeat the phrase, to seek the perfect. The perfect can be the enemy of the best. It would be perfect if it were 100%. But if we were to lose the entire game by trying to reach or attempt to reach that, then we will have done the city a disservice and we will have done our charge a disservice.
Mr. Acevedo, I greatly appreciate your comments. However, I could not disagree more. What I do with it in part, what I do agree with you on is that there are people in this city who agree with you. Absolutely, that's why we're having the conversation. They just so happen not to be the folks that tend to be on the side of really progressive policy as it relates to racial equity. It is true that when we look at the policy in totality, last year's interim policy, even what we are proposing in this moment, that we will see progress from where we were. But my equity core cannot ignore the data. The data is very clear about who and what the 20% represents. And if we are going to, again, if we're going to move in the direction of the 20% to respond to the voices of a few in this city who want to maintain a status quo, then I do believe it is incumbent upon us as a task force to wrestle with how we mitigate against the harm that will inevitably be caused to some of our most vulnerable children, particularly those who are lower income, particularly those who are victims of homelessness that may cause them to be more transient, and then therefore less likely to be able to get into a 20%. That's incumbent upon us. I am not willing to say good enough, especially when it comes to the children who so very frequently do not get enough. Ms. Scarrett.
Just focusing on the data, and I will say just from a personal perspective, this was not my hill. I'm good with where we are right now, but just from a data perspective, I think that we did see the 20% shift with to some level with the high poverty indicator. I think it's what we're calling the 10%. I also think that as it's structured now, the size of the tiers are such that the highest ranking students will probably get access either way. And so I do think at some point we're now in a city kind of symbolic conversation, almost in terms of where we are with the data. And so I think that's what makes this conversation a little challenging, because we all, have our different pieces that we bring. But unlike the zip codes, which were so small that when we, that this policy really did play with the edges in that same way, I think with the composite score model and the size of the tiers, the students are going to be invited. Are they going to be invited out of their tier, or are they going to be invited out of the 20%? The 20% could then free up more students in the tier, or we could do it all. This is why it's not my hill, but I just thought it might be useful to mention that I don't necessarily think with this particular policy shift that we're talking about a significant difference in the totality of the composition. And I think it's important that the composition reflects the full diversity of the city across all backgrounds, as that's one of the biggest learning benefits, as we know from the research and as we see firsthand in our schools.
Mr. Contrepas. You're on mute.
I think the task force has heard my position on the 2080. I've tried twice to influence the thinking toward it. I am a bit concerned, however, and I would like to suggest that if we do go with the 2080, which I hope we will, I would like to suggest that where we have indicated a poverty indicator of 10 points or 10% for every student who attends a school in Boston that has a poverty rate of 50% or higher, that we have already made a decision around a tier that has homeless students and has DCF students and will have families that reside in BHA housing. Those students, particularly the DCF and the homeless, have a level of mobility through no fault of their own in most instances, that they may well be strong test takers, But because of their situation, their opportunity in terms of grade production may be somewhat inhibited. So here's my suggestion. In that tier, those students would get an additional 5 points. Which would mean that if indeed they were in a school or attending a school in which they met the criterion that we've established of 50% or above, and they are in the category that I've just described, that they would get the equivalent of a 15-point bump. If indeed they were in a school that didn't have or didn't reach the threshold of 50%, they would get an additional 5 points. What that might do is allow students in that tier who may be somewhat disadvantaged by their environment to possibly be in the higher portion of the 20% or the higher portion of the 80%. And so I would like to offer that as a possibility linked to the 20-80%.
So Mr. Condon-Passos, let me reflect back to you what I think I heard. We have a tier that is inclusive of students in DCF custody, homeless students, and students residing in BHA housing. If a student fits into any of those vulnerable populations, regardless of what school the child attends, the child would receive a 15-point bump. The child would not receive a bump for attending a high poverty school. So in a sense, DCF, homeless, BHA housing residents would receive an additional 15 points on their composite score. And students who attend a high poverty school would receive an additional 10-point bump. Did I reflect that before I comment? Did I reflect that back?
I'm not sure that's what I said. Let me try again.
Okay.
The students that are already attending the students in this tier that are already attending a high poverty school, as we have defined them, are eligible for the 10-point bump. If they are identified as either DCF students, homeless students, or in BHA, they would get an additional 5 points.
So you're saying it's an and, they must attend a high poverty school and be homeless or in DCF custody or living in BHA housing?
That's right.
So how does that support the, going back to your point relative to mobility? How is that helpful to the student in DCF custody who is changing schools multiple times during the year and at the time of their application ends up at the Elliott School?
That student would would not be eligible for the 10 points according to our process. Is that not correct?
I would actually, based on what you shared earlier, I agree with you relative to the mobility. So for the student using this avatar of a student, the student in DCF custody who we know is very likely to be moving to multiple schools during the school year, who at the time, let's say in their 5th grade year, and at the time, they end up applying in the 6th grade, they happen to be in a seat at the Elliott School or the Orenberger, right? For that, I would say that child should receive 15 points, not just 5, because they haven't had the benefit of being in that school that's of a, that is better resourced. So what I thought I heard you say initially was, so let me say this, I appreciate where you're going, and this could address or help to mitigate some of this, because in a sense, it would help with the 20%. It wouldn't do anything for the tiers.
No.
But it could help with respect to the 20% and helping the 20% to be more inclusive. So, yeah.
Okay. No, it's, I think you've hit upon it. It's to address the issue that the mobility sometimes might lead to inconsistencies in grading. And where we have put such a heavy percentage on
grading,
those students would be getting 15 points. Let's leave it at that.
Okay. Ms. Aguirre, sorry, I'm just processing.
It's okay. Actually, what I understood from Mr. Contompassis is like homeless students, DCF, and students in BHA, they will automatically get a 5 points. That will result into 15 if on top of that, they were in a school with a high poverty level. That was my understanding. Maybe you got it wrong. But I mean, I think that if that was not what he proposed, I think that we could propose that too. And I hear what you're saying of the students changing schools and ending up at the wrong time in the good non-poverty school. So I wonder if there is any way, and maybe there's a question for Monica Hogan, that we can take into account that the student has been during, let's say, I don't know, 5th grade, 4th grade, 6th grade during the last 2 years or something, he has actually spent most or some time in a high poverty school, regardless of where they are at the time that they submit the application. Because I think that will be actually like more fair for the student. If he has spent 6 months in a high poverty school and at the time of doing the application, they are, as you say, at the Elliott or the Orenberger, that's against them. And we should take into account that most of his education, he has been in a school with these resources. So I wonder if it is a way of allocating these 10 points to any student who on the whatever X amount of time has been in a high poverty school.
Ms. Grasso.
two-part question. I guess one is, I'm still trying to figure out, are we still having a tier, a separate tier for DCF, BHA, and homeless, and proposing we give them additional points? Beyond the 10 points from coming from a high poverty school?
Yes, but that would only, because they would be in a tier unto themselves. The whether it's 10 points or 15 points, and Mr. Condopas is bringing this to the table, what that would help to potentially address is really what we see in the data for the 20%. It would have little to no impact in the tier. It would really impact potentially the 20%.
Okay. I'll hold my next question for a minute. I need to process. Thank you.
Yeah. So Mr. Condopas, and I know folks are processing this. So and under that scenario, right, because and that also helps with the grades. I'm sorry, I'm like Katie too, but I also process out loud, Katie, as well. I process in there and I process out, and I'm still okay. Miss Lum.
I'm just trying to work out in terms of the numbers. So if this group of BHA, DCF, and homeless students, if they are in their own tier, is that a tier 9? Or are they one of the 8 tiers? And how does that, because that would impact the number of invitations allowed per tier.
So the thinking is that they would be the 8th tier. 7 + 1. Ms. Hogan, is that correct? I believe that.
Yeah, we need to work out, I think, all of the details of how exactly they would all be sized still, but to make sure that they are proportionate and those implementation details. But I think the way I've been thinking about it is that like 1 + 7, then.
Ms. Grassa, thank you, Ms. Hogan. Ms. Grassa.
I keep thinking about the size of this tier for DCF, BHA, and homeless, and I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I do not suspect it will be as large as the other tiers. Like, would it be possible to give anyone who is in DCF custody, lives in BHA housing, or is homeless 15 points, and then put them in across 8 tiers and see a bump? That would give them a bump within tiers without having their own tier, because I'm struggling around understanding this 15 points and then they have their own tier.
So disregard the 15 points on the tier. I mean, it'll be part of their composite score, but since the students are in a tier together, it's not gonna make a difference for them. So the 15 points, or the 10 points for that matter, the 15 points really speak to the 20%.
But all of our simulations did not have this tier. So if we're thinking about our simulations and thinking about where we could see the 15 points matter, it would be within 8 tiers across the city, with not a tier for DCF, BHA, and homeless. But maybe giving them these 15 points, like they automatically get 15 points. You don't have to go to a high, an economically disadvantaged school to get the 10 points, because we make it 15 points and then they don't have their own tier. Like it would be.
So I will just say that one of the factors of our interim policy that actually people supported, like across the board, is the fact that we were very sensitive to DCF and homeless students and having that isolated tier. Like that was absolutely, again, like No one had a problem with that. Okay. With the putting the BHA in there is in response to was in response to negative feedback we received, you'll recall, about students living in BHA housing, public housing, who also resided in higher income neighborhoods and them being disadvantaged. And so pulling students living in BHA housing helps to address, alongside DCF and homeless students, is being responsive to a critique that the interim policy received. Ms. Garrett.
Just digging into the tiers a little bit more. If the 8th tier of the students that the groups that you named, Ms. Sullivan, is a tier that ends up being a quarter of the size of the other tiers, are we proposing a proportionate admission, just similar to the way the zip codes worked based on the size of the tier? Because I think that one thing that Ms. Grassa might be reacting to is the difference between the tier model and the zip code model was that the tier model was going to be relatively equally sized.
Yes.
And so just trying to reconcile that, whereas Ms. Hogan can play with the numbers on the other tiers based on where her cutoffs are, the number of the 8th tier is going to be what it is based on the students who qualify based on those indicators. So is that a proportional admissions, or is that something for the implementation conversation?
Right. So that is implementation.
Okay.
And so our charge as a task force is not related to implementation.
Okay. I would just be conscious of then are not necessarily stating things around this equal seats or something like that, maybe overstating our recommendation if we don't need implementation details. My other just question, and maybe I just after Dr. Tung goes, maybe Mr. Kreger could offer some thoughts as someone who's often just reminding us about the cautions of shaping groups. I just, in terms of this suggestion, I would wonder what his thoughts are in terms of the 20% and now creating different circumstances that would impact the 20%, just from that lens that he often brings.
Dr. Tung?
So we've been saying that we have to keep it simple to explain to the public. And from this exchange, it's pretty convoluted. I'm sort of having trouble connecting the 20% citywide conversation with this conversation. We'd have to say something like the data shows that a 20% set aside is inequitable and harms diversity and is a barrier to access. But we're keeping it because we're going to give extra points in a separate tier of a different size to DCF, housingless, and BHA students, which I support giving them extra points, and we'll be safer from litigation, and we'll keep those who have power and privilege happy. Is this what this conversation is about?
Mr. Chernow.
I would just like to add that this whole, y'all gonna hate me for saying this, but this whole conversation, I've just been thinking, I feel like one alternative that would really be hard to uphold in court is a lottery. How would someone prove that a lottery is towards certain students, but we've thrown that off the table? So it seems like if we're really trying to create a system that can be upheld in court, I don't know, the lottery seems like the most, I mean, I guess Mr. Kreger can speak more to that, but it seems like really hard to defend a literal lottery that y'all have all described as random.
Mr. Kreger.
The thing, so I'm trying to figure out where to go first on this. I think this is what I want to say about the law. The only time the US Supreme Court has weighed in on what it calls voluntary integration, Chief Justice Roberts, together with several of the sitting justices, not only threw out as unconstitutional plans in Seattle and Louisville that involved placing students in schools by classifying them on the basis of their race. They also questioned whether or not schools had a compelling interest in promoting racial diversity. But Chief Justice Roberts and the three justices who joined him in questioning that did not comprise a majority of the court. Instead, Anthony Kennedy and the four more liberal-leaning justices, in separate opinions, said, number one, there was a compelling interest in promoting diversity. Right? And number two, Justice Kennedy, often the swing vote on the court, said, there's no way you can assign students to schools without knowing what this does by a racial impact. In fact, it's no different than voting and redistricting, where you can't redistrict without understanding that you're going to change the racial demographics of a district. With that in mind, Justice Kennedy proposed a series of generalized race conscious and otherwise race neutral solutions so that a district could do what it's always done and be aware of the racial demographics of its schools without feeling like it was going to be the next one in line for a constitutional challenge. And I'll say this, what we did in the interim policy met all of the criteria of what Justice Kennedy proposed, at least according to the federal district court in which our policy was challenged. And to date, the US First Circuit Court of Appeals, which reviewed our policy at the express request of the plaintiffs under a preliminary injunction. Right? That feels like legal mumbo jumbo. Here's what I want to say. I think the danger for what we're doing is no different than the danger for Lowell High School in San Francisco or Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, any of the places where you're trying to change admissions policies at selective high schools to see greater racial, socioeconomic, and neighborhood diversity, right? That because the court has changed, because Justice Kennedy has retired, because Justice Ginsburg has sadly passed, right? The court looks a lot different now than it did in Parents Involved, all of which could harm what we're trying to do, right? The courts below are tasked with applying the law that's set by the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court ultimately gets to be the one that decides, what fits in, decides what the guidelines are. Do we run a risk that our policy will be declared unconstitutional? Of course we do, right? Any policy can be declared unconstitutional. What makes me feel very confident about what we've done, both here and in the interim policy, is that we've relied on all of the race neutral criteria that Justice Kennedy proposed in his opinion in Parents Involved. Okay. I think our plan stands well on its own 2 feet, even if we only do 100% tier. I think our plan is not tied to race, is not even tied to a specific neighborhood, right? But groups students on the basis of the census tract income level that's averaged in their neighborhood. We never look at the individual race, socioeconomic status, wealth, neighborhood of any student, right? I like what we've proposed because I recognize that the court has changed in composition significantly. And I recognize that what Justice Kennedy proposed was not a proposal shared by Justices Alito, Roberts, or Thomas, who all still remain on the court. Right? I see a value in further undercutting any question about whether our policy assigns students on the basis of their race, right? I don't think that giving a particular weight to homeless students, DCF involved students, or BHA residing students does anything to raise further red flags for me. And so I think that's fine, but I'm just gonna say this, right? Like, if the US Supreme Court is going to topple the promotion of racial diversity, it's gonna do it, whatever we do. It's gonna do it, whatever San Francisco does, and it's gonna do it, whatever Virginia does, if it feels that the promotion of racial diversity cannot be a compelling state interest. Right? Because what we've said is it can and it should be. Our job is not to racially balance the exam schools to make them look like the district, but our job is to promote the benefits of diversity. And if the US Supreme Court no longer feels like that's a valid thing to do, then we have problems along with every single other school district in the country. My take is, to be honest, stick with 100% tiers, right? And if there are folks around the city who feel so strongly otherwise, they can go tell the school committee, right? And the school committee can decide if what they really need is an additional legal rampart to support them, they can have it. But I think what we've done as a group after all this time to work toward consensus is incredibly valuable. And to me, our consensus at this stage is the most important thing.
Ms. Garrett.
Process question about the school committee recommendation to Mr. Kreger's point. Tomorrow is not a vote, correct? It's the proposal. And there would be a period of time and then there's a vote, or is there a vote on the?
Tomorrow's not a vote. Tomorrow's it's just it's the recommendation of the task force. Oh, sorry.
And this is, so would the school committee, whether they choose to use it or not, be able to make an adjustment to our recommendation to them if they chose, or?
Yes, similar to the changes, the modifications that we made to the interim policy. You know, we presented, we got public comment, and made some adjustments to the policy between the time it was initially presented and the time that they voted on it. So I'm sorry. Good? Okay. So here we are. And look, let's have the conversation. Mr. Kreger, I could not agree with you more. I could not agree with you more. Mr. Chernow, I could not agree with you more. But the reality is that while we're coming to this space, to this table to make policy, to make a policy recommendation, that's what we care about. The reality of the situation is that we are doing so in a political ecosystem. Got to name it. And there are some not so good people out there, I'm just going to say it, who do not want us to achieve our charge. And so are making it very difficult, Mr. Kreger, for our consensus to be what is presented to the school committee. I am, and I'm very proud of it, I am a student of the civil rights movement. I'm a daughter and a beneficiary of the civil rights movement. And so what I know to be true is that this is not new. And what I also know to be true is that we cannot be deterred. And so I want to be clear about this 20% conversation. It is political. And so as I look at the data, once again, it's clear about who this benefits, making it very clear as to why there are those who are so adamant that it must exist. This is the same challenge we had as a working group. Those of you who were on the working group, you know, this is the same exact challenge. I can get there, but I'm not going to get there without some sort of mitigating factor. There has to be, just as we have every other objection, every other criticism, every other pushback relative to the interim policy, we have painstakingly attempted to address in some way. We have to do it with this one. So I do believe that Mr. Kandapassis, coming back to you, to your suggestion, I do believe that one of the ways to get there, and specifically just a little bit, because it's not fully addressing the issue. One of the ways to try to mitigate what we know the data says relative to the 20%, I do think could come with the 15 points that you described. And so in order to respond to the political moment, and I am naming it, I do think that doing the 2080 with a 15-point indicator for upward indicator for students who are homeless, in DCF custody, or living in BHA housing could give some of our most vulnerable kids a fighting chance to access that 20%. So I can get there with that 15 points. Mr. Contemposis. You're on mute.
I think you all realize that that was an extremely difficult conversation that Ms. Sullivan just had. It is clear, and has been clear to the two of us, that absent this particular piece, there may well be an impact on the district that none of us want to see. So part of my effort to try to mitigate this particular difficult issue is to get folks on the task force to recognize from the two of us that we think, even though we may not fully accept the rationale, that we need to go in this direction. We have made tremendous strides in the 60+ hours that we've been meeting since February. We have introduced many new innovative changes that I think recognize some of the comments, many of the comments that we've heard in open session. The changes we have made, not only in the interim year, But hopefully, as we move forward with these recommendations, we'll make a tremendously important, will have a tremendously important impact on giving the students who will attend the exam schools an opportunity to learn from one another based on some of the changes that we've made. And so I want to thank Ms. Sullivan for having to offer this point of view. And I can assure you that you don't weigh this on what might be considered her own thinking, but you weigh it on what I believe the two of us have come to realize is the greater good. And so, with all deference to Mr. Krager, I do believe that we've made tremendous strides in the work that we attempted to do, we have done. And the fact that adding the points to the most vulnerable population that we have in BPS, to give them an opportunity to at least make it into the 20% portion of this recommendation. Is the appropriate thing to do. And I'll leave it at that.
Ms. Lum, Mr. Kreger.
Thank you. And I want to thank Mr. Kreger because he actually gave me a bit of an aha moment here, which is that ultimately the decision regarding this policy recommendation rests with the school committee. And in my mind and opinion, the political ramifications of this policy decision rests more with that committee than it necessarily does with this task force. So if this task force is to make a recommendation that balances the recognition of the social inequities that this city, that exists in the city outside the purview and control of BPS, or perhaps other systems within the city itself. If we can make a recommendation such as the 100% tier, why wouldn't we? If we don't have, I mean, I don't personally, maybe others do, have any concerns about political ramifications, and let the school committee decide whether they need to compromise further on that front to get something acceptable.
Mr. Kreger.
So in light of your comments, Ms. Sullivan, and Mr. Kanampas's, and perhaps in response to Ms. Lum's, I feel the weight and importance of coming out with a recommendation that wrestles with all of this from within us. Right? So that what we recommend to the school committee demonstrates that not only did we hear feedback from student listening sessions, community listening sessions, and public comment every time we met, right? But also that we heard it in real time. And that we were willing to incorporate and listen to feedback such that what gets presented to the school committee reflects that we've done that wrestling and done that wrestling for them in the hope, and it's only a hope, that that gives them sufficient room to weigh our work for what it is. Right? Our best effort at consensus based on feedback from across the entire city throughout this process. With that in mind, I can support what you both have named as an 80-20 model that that incorporates a different weight for our students in BHA, in DCF custody or care, and our homeless students. And I would hope that those who are joining us tonight appreciate the work that's been done to address in real time the concerns that we've heard. Because this process has been incredibly difficult, right? And I'm just gonna say this, I think throughout this process, both in the task force and in the working group, we've been incredibly lucky to have the involvement of all of us and the leadership of you, Tanisha, and you, Mike. And to speak directly to you, Tanisha, right? You know, you and I have done this by holding forums across the city, right? For years. We did several public records requests to the district to get this sort of data so we could analyze it together, so we could write about it together, so that we could make sense of it, right? And I'm proud of the consensus that we reached as the working group that we had in the spring. And I'm similarly proud of whatever comes out of this process, because I think what we've done as a group is substantial, and I can fully support the direction it is that you wish to go here, and I recognize that it is done with a vision of the leadership of the NAACP that that has guided our city to its better angels over generations on matters of securing educational equity for all of our youth, right? And I see it quite clearly here in this path forward that you're suggesting for us. So I'm on board.
Ms. Lum?
I just want to maybe perhaps state for the record, the pragmatist in me has no doubt that we can reach consensus. So I want to put that on the table. I do want to say, and perhaps this is what has been done over the last 60+ hours, that we have an opportunity, the idealist in me sees an opportunity here. Make sure we don't miss the opportunity to push the envelope a little bit more on the systemic structures that we are trying to overcome and chip away at with the compromises that we are making. I think, Ms. Sullivan, you've done that beautifully. I think Mr. C has also raised his voice on this front as well. So I want to join Mr. Kreger in thanking you for your leadership and thanking everyone on this committee for their voices as well. So I just want to state that and understand that if there is opportunity to ensure that whatever policy recommendations we make acknowledges that we are making them within a system that is imperfect to begin with and provides BPS an opportunity to leverage other resources, including the ESSER, to address some of the issues that we could not address because it was not under our purview or otherwise. I would hope that that comes across in this effort.
Thank you, Ms. Lum. Thank you, Mr. Kreger. Mr. Kreger, something you said, I just want to lift. We need to, I think it's important, and that is relative to making it clear, and we will, whatever the recommendation is, we will do this tomorrow, making it clear that there have been adjustments made by this task force to be responsive to, as you articulated, whether it's public comment or the data, the research, what have you, but also just what is happening within the ecosystem so that the same forces are not then putting pressure on the school committee. Like, we're done. So I want you, I heard that, and I do, that resonates with me. So thank you. Mr. Chernow?
I'm just a little confused as to how this whole system works, because I thought we were the people in the task force coming together to make the decision. And I thought we were listening to the public and taking in their opinion and meeting and having public testimony and talking for 60+ hours to come to a decision. And I'm confused as to where this pretty much anonymous backlash has came in the past 24 hours. I mean, if it's that important to someone, then why don't they come and talk to us and speak up, testify? Like, we haven't heard from we haven't heard that. Like, all of a sudden there's these like these ghosts that are speaking that have this power. Like, I hope no one's getting threatened on this task force, because that's kind of what it's like. And on all seriousness, I hope people are respecting everyone in this task force and the conclusion that whoever agrees and disagrees comes to. Because I mean, we've held public comment at every single public meeting that we've had. This is a public meeting laws, which someone else can explain a lot better than I can. So I'm just a little confused as to where this backlash is coming, and if there was more specifics about this, I would love to have them, or even hear from the people saying them, because hey, if they're out there, come talk to us. Like,
Dr. Chernow, as always. Dr. Freeman Wisdom.
Good evening, everyone. As has already been stated, a lot of time has been put into trying to come to consensus. We've talked about race. We've talked about equity. We've talked about white supremacy. We've talked about a lot of things here. So for us to be at this point right now, where all of that work is now being questioned I won't say question, I guess being told that this has to go this way, it's a problem for me. It was hard for me to get to 70-30. I was a 60-40 person, I was, but we had the conversations and we got to that point. And so now, because of, I'll just say the powers that be, we're giving into that. And how do we sit as a task force fighting for students and we give into that? It doesn't sit well with me at all. And at the same time, we still haven't even, I know we've said it's not the charge of this task force, but the real issue is that our students, when we look at the 4th grade, 3rd and 4th grade test scores, the students within Boston Public Schools are not performing at the same level as some of their white peers. And, you know, I know this is where this work ends. And maybe this would feel better if there was, like I said, if we were still working, if there was a task force that was working on that piece around to find out what's happening with it, what's happening with those with our students at that level. And that's not to blame any teacher or any school leader, but rather the systems and structures that are in place that do not allow our students to be educated at that same rate. So this is problematic for me, and I cannot be quiet about it and just go along to get along. Because if we don't stand for something, we fall for anything. And that's who I am as an educator, and that's what I promote to my students. And I'll stop there.
So, okay. $6:45. I want to say, let's take another recess, 5 minutes, shall we? Yesterday that turned into 20, I know. Ms. Garrett.
Do we also need for tomorrow an immediate recommendation for the interim bridge plan to 23?
Oh, yes. Why don't we talk about that?
I think we're really close there, and
Okay.
if maybe that might be something that we can resolve maybe quickly.
Great. What do you have?
I would be happy to propose to move us along that we have already determined the grade band that would be used for entering 7th graders. We discussed fall 6th grade grades of the first 2 terms and the first trimester for the subjects that we named. I think that we should use the same tier model that we plan to use in future years as a way to get that started. So basically suspending that assessment until our students get reacclimated to school fully in person, and replicating the model that's used for the 23-24 model minus the assessment.
Okay. So that's a recommendation on the table. Dr. Tung?
My hand is up for for another easy topic after.
Okay, so let's close out this one.
But I
Okay.
agree with Ms. Garrett's proposal.
Okay, great. Mr. Acevedo?
Yes, I think that would be, I'd always thought that it would be easier for us to come to consensus with 23, 24 than it would be for the next year. But I think it's obvious that our students, if anything, this year have had an even more difficult pandemic year than the one that we were weighing as a working group last summer and in October.
Ms. Aguirre?
I was just wondering, for the next couple of years, are we also going to be using the extra 10, 15 points?
For the upcoming year?
Mhm.
It would be whatever, the way I understood Ms. Garrett's recommendation is that it would be whatever the policy is for 23, 24 minus the assessment.
Okay, no, that's what I wanted to make sure that we are using that.
Ms. Grassa?
I also support the plan that Ms. Garrett chaired.
Right. Is there any resounding objection? Okay, seeing none, that is how we'll move forward. Thank you, Ms. Garrett. Dr. Tung.
We had talked about other parts of the recommendation for tomorrow night.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a couple of suggestions.
Okay.
some of which is recapping long ago conversations. One is to make sure that we provide the new admissions policy information in all the native languages, both online and in print and in community centers. And the second has to do with, I think originally it was Mr. Contenpas's suggestion about annual monitoring. And so my language around that would be, we want to know about applicants, invitees, and enrollees. Besides the outcomes indicators, we want to know about school climate and mental health surveys. All of the information should be disaggregated by group and by school. And we'd like somebody to do the research on comparing the cohorts from 2020 onward, because we have a natural experiment going on. Not that I think we're experimenting on our kids, but that the data will be useful.
Say it, researcher.
Ms. Tung, if I may, could you perhaps put that in writing for us as quickly as you can?
Yep. I can send,
you.
I can copy and paste it into.
Thank
an
you.
email to Elena.
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo? Oh, okay. Mr. Kreger. You're on mute.
Raise a point that we'd favorably discussed before, but that should be included in reaching the qualification of a high poverty school. We should use the 5-year average of student enrollment or something along those lines, so that parents, students, others know what to expect of how their school is considered.
Again, Mr. Kreger, can you please put that in writing as well?
Of course, yep.
And I think there's one other piece, if I may. We had talked about a 3 to 5 year review. And that needs to be, I don't know, I think maybe a month ago, Mr. Kreger, I asked you to consider putting something down regarding that.
Already got it and can send it over.
There you go. Thank you. And we will include the form, the language that you wrote previously that was shared orally in our meetings around town, put it that way.
So on that point, I would actually, I'd give the recommendation of 5 years so that we can stay away from, or try to stay away from mayoral election cycles.
Agreed.
So 5 years.
Yep.
Thank you. Mr. Chernow.
I was gonna talk about that, so that's.
Oh,
all I-
okay.
Is there
And these
anything else that we talked about?
Ms. Nagasawa.
This is kind of down the line, and maybe a minor detail that can be worked out in 5 years, but I'd recommend, I appreciate Mr. Chernow's and I presence on this task force, but I do think that student voice should be expanded, and student voice that is not necessarily already in the exam schools. I think it's also important to include students who do not attend the exam schools.
Second that.
It's good. Well, seeing as the two of you will be co-chairing this in 5 years, just make a mental note.
I don't know, Ms. Sullivan, they're going some pretty powerful schools. I think I'm hopeful they'll come back.
They have to. It's part of the responsibility, their
I see.
responsibility.
We didn't tell them that up front. You know.
No, but you're on notice. Again, and these are in addition to what we've had on the slides previously, relative to the work that needs to happen in the summer boot camp for admitted students, as well as the investments in ELA and math at the elementary grade levels to really try to tackle this readiness and access to rigor for BPS students at the elementary grade level. So all of those will be incorporated. We've talked about those ad nauseum. So anything else that folks either want to make sure we don't forget to have as part of the recommendation or want to add? Ms. Garrett.
I think Ms. Grassa might be more familiar with this at that grade level, but I know there is some work happening at around grading in BPS and that process. And I don't think we necessarily know enough as a task force to make a definitive recommendation, but I might frame it as a recommendation that BPS considers effects of adjustments to grading policy as they could impact, especially if it's in a harmful way, students in this or any other process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Agreed.
Great. Any others?
Yep. I also think having a teacher or two on here would be very helpful. And having some teacher insight, whether they are across any kind of K-12 school. I think it's always helpful to have someone in the elementary grades who understands some of the things. I think hence my role as a leader. There's things I know from that end, but also someone in the high school realm who kind of understands that is always beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Great. Great. All right.
May I ask Ms. Grasser or the other heads of school on any of the task force groups that the district puts together? Isn't there a requirement that there be a teacher or two sitting on them? Or is it just at the whim of the person putting the task force together?
I don't actually know. This is my first time being on a task force. I would say Pastor Acevedo might know. I know he's been on several task force before.
I don't, yeah, thanks, Ms. Beth. I mean, but you, in all humility, you also served on the superintendent search committee.
Correct.
As
I'm
I
sorry.
recall, I have a faint recollection that you might have done that.
I was sorry.
But There's no requirement that teachers serve on ongoing task forces, but I know that there's a teacher on the opportunity, there are a couple of teachers on the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Task Force. And I believe there's also at least one teacher on the ELL task force.
Yeah, sorry, I'll take my statement back. I guess this is my second task force. However, that was done in private in executive committee meetings versus public, which is why the confusion.
Okay,
Okay. So that was good. So that's done. Mr. Contenpasses?
yeah, I think we're ready to go back to 23, 24 and try to reach consensus on a very difficult issue. And it would be worthwhile to reach consensus on this. And that doesn't in any way discredit what all of you have said. As I mentioned before, this is not an easy conversation in terms of what we presented this evening. It is, I think, as much as I would not like to do this, I think it is necessary that you consider what the two co-chairs, I guess that's an oxymoron, but what the co-chairs have said regarding this issue. And recognize that it's been said before, we've accomplished a great deal. And if both Ms. Sullivan and I didn't think that this was necessary, we would not have put it on the agenda. And so my hope is that we can make this a consensus decision and perhaps suggest that we include something to the effect with reservation or whatever. But it is essential that, in my mind anyways, that we move this thing forward with all of us agreeing to it. I don't know of any other way to put it.
Yeah, Ms. Aguirre?
Yeah, I think that we have done like an incredible amount of work, that we have come together from very different positions, and we have managed to kind of create a consensus that everybody has given up something that was important for them, because we thought it was important to get it done, and to get done something that we basically, something that we could be proud of, and be proud because we thought we do something good for the kids, for the families, and for the city. And I think that it's sad that at the very last moment, something gets in there. and we have to review things after all these months of thinking and compromising and talking and influencing each other. I think that both of you have done an incredible job co-chairing the task force, and I trust you that if you make the recommendation, I mean, I trust that that you are doing it because it's what we need to do.
Well, I guess, Ms. Sullivan, we are in a position where we have to ask if, and it might help to go through, maybe we don't, but it might help to go through all of the recommendations that we have for school year 23-24, so that everybody is on the same wavelength. And let's see if we have been successful in getting to consensus.
Sure. All right, so we have actually, could you, Ms. Hogan, maybe? Could you put the slide back up that you had earlier today, please?
And I've tried to take notes.
Wonderful.
So we'll see how I did.
Thank you.
So this is the original slide, and I have a next slide that I tried to reflect the conversation that you had.
Okay, great. Thank you.
May I just interject? I think there was a question as to which tier we had decided to use. I don't think we actually put that on there. I think, Ms. Hogan, you used tier 5.
The simulations we shared yesterday used tier option 5, which includes the percentage of people under poverty or in the poverty level, instead of median household income. We don't see major shifts to the data with the different tier options.
And what's the benefit of using one versus the other?
We chose tier option 5 yesterday in response to comments around the use of median income in the interim plan, and comments that it didn't fully reflect the income of people, all people in the geographic area, particularly the lower income people in an area that might have higher median income. And so chose the poverty level percentage in response to some of that feedback.
Thank you.
Is there any opposition to using tier 5?
Ms. Aguirre, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, just a question, and I apologize, but I cannot remember. What do we agree about families with having a first language that is not English?
The consensus, as I heard it, was to include that in the tier calculation. So that is part of tier option 5.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is, let's see, 70, 30 GPA. Yeah. Is it, I just want to be clear, it's not census, it's SES census tract tier. It's just to be specific on that, right? This is. Yeah. Thank you.
I also want to confirm in the interim policy is 20% of invitations at each school.
What did we do? Yeah, okay. So
That's
in the,
what we did before, yes.
yeah. So whatever we did before.
Does anyone see anything we left out of this that should be in it? Other than all of the other recommendations that we just discussed, which will be put together in the slide deck.
So 10 rounds of invitations, 10% each round, distributed,
Yep.
specialized here. Yeah, okay. I think that's right.
Can I offer a suggestion about wording?
Yes.
Under the high poverty indicator, just some adjustment to make clear that there aren't 25 potential points. I don't know if it should be a word maximum or something. It just sounded like those two could be added together. Okay. And I don't know if we're not actually dealing with points. We're dealing with a percent. I can't remember the exact way that Ms. Hogan calculated, but maybe, I guess we can keep calling it points, but I don't think that's actually completely accurate. It was a 10% change to the composite, but that's not necessarily 10 points. It's multiplying the composite score times 1.1. So
This is a good clarification. My understanding was that everyone in the group would get the same amount. So when we said 10%, it was like 10% of the possible points.
Oh, okay. So then it is a universal.
That was my understanding.
Okay.
It is a good clarification point to make.
Yep.
I'm sorry, could you restate that, please?
When we were talking about 10%, I think there's a question of if students would receive a 10% of their current composite score bonus, which if you have a lower composite score, would not give you as much of an increase, as many points increase, versus an interpretation where everyone in this group gets the same number increase. Not sure if I explained that well.
I'm not sure that I follow what we think is going to happen here. So what I heard was, so points, I understand what that would look like. Are you saying that you're not doing points?
If, say, total possible points 100, one student has 90 points, one student has 85. There are, if you added 10% to each student's score, the student with 85 would get 8.5 additional points.
Right.
The student with 90 would get 9. The other option would be, because there are 100 possible points, 10% of 100 would just be 10 points added.
Right.
So 85 would become 95 and 90 would become 100.
And so how did you run the simulation?
With the adding 10 points, or everyone gets the same number of points added.
It's a fixed number of points.
Yes,
Okay.
that's a good word.
Okay.
And if that's the case, then the wording as it stands does make sense. So my question was only if it were proportional, then I didn't think the language was clear, but explaining it that way, I do think it seems precise.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Is there another slide? No.
So,
The next slide was the 22-23 capturing, I believe, GPA only, with the grades only from 6th grade. And then a note with the invitation mechanism to reflect what is decided for 23-24.
Right.
And my last slide is my attempt to capture the additional recommendations that you also named.
And we can work through that piece.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Can we go back to screen?
Yeah. Ms. Aguirre.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still wondering, and I don't want to make it more difficult, but I was thinking students who go to a high poverty school, K to 5, and in 6th grade, they move to a different kind of a school. Is there any way to help them? Or that just makes things too much complicated?
Ms. Hogan? That's actually a good, do we have, which schools in the district would that apply to, that would do K-5 and then move? Ms. Garza?
There are a few, we still do have a few single standing middle schools. And then we do have some schools that are 6-12 and several schools that end in 5th grade. I'm not sure how many of them there are at this point, because I can't remember who's getting a 6th grade this year or who's maybe getting one in another year.
We just added 6th grade to quite a few K-5s as well. So I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I do know we looked at the data of roughly what percentage of students changed schools between 5th and 6th grade. And it was about a third of students last year.
Okay. Okay. But to Ms. Aguirre's question, Ms. Hogan, is there?
Ms. Aguirre, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what I was wondering is like if a student has been going to a high poverty K to 5 school, and then in 6th grade, he goes to a different school that is not high poverty. How is that going to be impacting the getting or not getting the 10 points that could actually cannot really make a difference, since most of the education has been happening in a kind of high poverty school?
I think two options sort of come to mind. I think one is, I think a suggestion on the table was using the school that submits the 5th grade grades for the student as the school in which we use to determine the high poverty indicator. A more complex solution would be trying to look at student movement between schools. Students may also attend more than one school during their 5th grade year. And I think that gets a little more complicated to try and explain which school counts when. So I don't have a straightforward answer. I think the clearest answer for families would be to be able to say it is the school as of X time, either the end of 5th grade or the beginning of 6th grade. But
so that's actually interesting. to do, because sixth grade is the change, sixth grade is when the student, and it's the fall when the application happens. So that could be interesting to do, to take the school from the fifth grade. Ms. Garrett.
I agree with choosing a year, and I think that there are challenges with both, but I like the suggestion Ms. Hogan made to whichever year it is, to have the school match who sends the report card. Because you've been there long enough to have some sort of grade assessment. So instead of- I think, I know we're not doing implementation, but it would be nice to not have parents have to supply an additional piece of information. If we're already getting grades, then choosing the report card from one year or the other seems like the most way to understand the policy, even though you may be missing a few folks. I do appreciate what Ms. Aguirre is saying, but I think it should align to a report card submission, whichever one is decided.
Can you capture that language, Ms. Hogan?
To,
As Ms. Garrett has just suggested?
of selecting either fifth.
Yeah. I mean, I would leave that is an implementation issue. But if you could capture that language, we could include it in the recommendations.
So I believe the school is this, I think what I'm hearing.
Yes. I think fifth has a more likely chance of having a longer touch point or a multi-year touch point than the sixth grade, to Ms. Aguirre's point. But if that proves difficult, I do understand, but I think my leaning would be to fifth grade.
Okay. Is there anything else that we have not included in the potential slide deck that hopefully will be put together sometime tomorrow? Well, I guess we now have to broach the issue around the 23-24 set of recommendations and whether indeed we have consensus for the recommendations we put in place, to include the 2080 and the 15 points as was described prior for the DCF, homeless, and BHA kids. Does anyone object to the recommendations as described for school year 23-24 and beyond?
Mr. Chernow.
I'll raise my hand because I object to it. Sorry.
Wait,
No,
which slide are you talking about? Object to the 20% set aside?
No, I am talking about accepting the 23-24 recommendations as we have presented them.
But we have two versions. Right?
Well, I had meant it to include the 2080 and the additional points as I described them earlier. I'm trying to put all of these
So-
into one recommendation. If
Right.
there's a better way to do it, so be it.
All right, so this is what I will, so let me try it this. So, because, you know, I have objection. However, I'm willing to, you know, present the recommendation with the 2080. So maybe it is, you know, in terms of framing this is, look, we had consensus yesterday on the 70-30 with the 100% straight rank. Okay. Mr. Contreras and I are suggesting that, you know, in response to some additional feedback and concerns that the task force, instead of doing the 70-30 with 100% straight rank, that the task force would, I'll say it this way, would allow us to present on your behalf a recommendation that is a 70-30 split with, on the mechanism, a 2080 seat allocation, straight rank, that is inclusive of 10-point bump for students attending high poverty school, or a 15-point bump for DCF, homeless, and BHA residents. May we present that recommendation on your behalf? Mr. Kreger.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Tung? Hand down.
No.
Okay.
We've accomplished a great deal. I appreciate both of your leadership, and I also appreciate my fellow task force members. What Dr. Freeman Wisdom said resonated with me. If I bow to political pressure now, what does that say about my position and voice and power as an advocate and an activist moving forward? What does it say about how I model for my daughter? So I'm a strong no.
Other,
Ms. Sullivan, for me, it's a no for me, Ms. Sullivan.
Are there any other objections?
I'm also know if that wasn't clear from the first time that I said it, but just to say it again, just in case.
I also say no.
No, I am really torn here because part of me is with Dr. Wisdom, saying like, okay, now we have to kind of take into account the politics on top of everything else. So that will kind of put me into a no. On the other side, I really not sure what are the consequences of saying no, what's gonna happen if our whole recommendation is gonna be kind of tossed away. And because of that, honestly, I really am not sure what to say. So again, part of me is like, no, no way. We are not gonna be voting because they need us to do that. On the other side, like what happens is actually, we don't want to present the 2080, the 2080, yes. What's gonna happen? Do we have an answer to that?
So it's a hard question to answer, okay? It's a hard question to answer. That said, so a few things happen from a process standpoint. So we will make a recommendation. We'll come to some decision tonight on a recommendation. And we will present that recommendation to the superintendent. The superintendent actually makes the recommendation to the school committee. Okay. The school committee will receive our recommendation tomorrow evening. And will, there'll be public comment before, there'll be public comment after. There are, oh, by the way, other matters being taken up tomorrow as well. There will then be, subject to school committee scheduling, there will then be a date set for the school committee to vote. Typically, that is either 1 to 2 weeks following the presentation of a recommendation, okay? During that interim period, there will likely be, additional comments coming from the public. Similar to with the interim policy, we will, we may be asked to make some, adjustments to certain aspects of the policy. And when it comes time for the vote, there will be a final policy recommendation for the school committee to vote on. Okay, and the school committee will vote that. Typically what happens is the school committee votes that up or down.
So could we present the 100% and then have us coming to back and say like, no, we are not gonna be taking that, it has to be 80-20?
The recommendation that we have put on the table tonight is the 2080 with the additional bump, as we've talked about it. That's what, if we have to, we obviously do not have consensus. And so it may be necessary, unless there are others, to put this to a vote. Ms. Lum, I think you have your hand up.
Assuming things have not changed from last night, if there is consensus on the 100% tier ranking, why is that off the table?
I think both Ms. Sullivan and I have made every effort to suggest that we have heard that there's difficulty with that.
So look, I think in an ideal situation, we would make one recommendation. Take it and tweak it, modify it, throw it out the window, approve it, whatever the school committee chose to do. We could give them 2 recommendations.
I was going to ask if that would be a possibility, that by consensus, the committee has recommendation 1, by vote, the committee has recommendation 2.
I mean, are we suggesting like a plan A and plan B? Like our first recommendation will be this, but that will be a second option?
We could give them 2. I mean, and what we know is that the difference between the 2 is this. But these are the 2. We could, I'm just saying that is not. And ultimately, you know, it is, again, we'll give the recommendation to the superintendent and she'll also have a weight in this. And the school committee has the vote. That is not, let me just say this, that is not the ideal situation. I want to be clear on that. That is not the ideal situation. We have been asked to provide a recommendation, not 2. Dr. Tung, I think, and then let me just make sure I got the order right. I think Dr. Tung, oh, I lost it. Okay. Dr. Tung and then Ms. Aguirre.
One thing I worry about with the 2 recommendations, because I also thought about that, is that the worst thing that could happen is that the school committee receives the 2 recommendations if the superintendent doesn't make the decision and they have trouble deciding and we run out of time and it defaults to pre-pandemic.
Indeed. Ms. Aguirre.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this kind of like bothers me because I could have been open to an 80-20, you know, but the fact that somehow it is imposed on us and we are like in the background, you know, we have not been told why it has to be an 80-20. Honestly, that really bothers me, you know. We have been sitting here for I don't know how many hours, opening our minds and our hearts in front of like hundreds of people, you know, keeping positions that sometimes they were like well accepted and sometimes they were not. A bunch of people here have been like insulted, directly insulted. And through all that, we have been trying to kind of make it work. And yesterday, it was painful, but we arrived at something that we all decided we can live with. And then now, somehow we are told that we have to change our mind. And again, you have my trust. And I think that if you're recommending that, there's a good reason why you're doing it. But still, it really bothers me.
And I appreciate that. We both appreciate that, Ms. Aguirre. You know, look, so I want to be like, we still have free will in this, right? We do still have free will in this. Again, I think, you know, based on what I know, look, I would not have said what I said earlier if I didn't think that this was going to help not only from the standpoint of what we're working on now, but also help with respect to other things. But I want to be real clear, and I'm going back to Mr. Kreger's point. This is it. You know, this is not comfortable at all. I do not feel like, I also want to be clear on this. Look, we do have to be mindful of kind of everything that's going on around us. But at the end of the day, we've got to make the best decision to meet the charge and the task that's in front of us. And I do believe, and Mr. Contenpasa shared this earlier, I do believe that whether it's 100% or it's 2080, that we are moving our district forward, that we are creating more opportunities for more Boston kids, that we are helping to strengthen these schools. I know everybody thinks that BLS is already there, but it's not. It can be better. I do believe that regardless of which one is advanced, we will have met our charge. We will have exceeded our charge. So I do want to, so it's not a compromise in the sense of sacrificing the charge. Mr. Acevedo, Ms. Grassa, Mr. Kreger.
I'd be interested in hearing from, and I appreciate, in fact, the agony is coming from each of you, coming very clear, very clear. I think that one of the what ifs that is missing from this discourse, you know, and I think that the task force needs to know, if you, Ms. Sullivan, or you, Mr. Contenpasas, you know, can just, you know, answer the so what question. If we do not achieve consensus tonight, or even an agreement tonight, so what? What would be the consequences if we do not achieve consensus? I mean, what's the worst that could happen if we don't meet our charge tonight?
It's okay if I go. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, go ahead, Ms. Grassa.
Acevedo. Thank you. I'm very uncomfortable with this decision for all of the reasons that are said. I think I don't need to repeat anything that Dr. Freeman Wisdom said. But I do echo her sentiments earlier, and I truly respect her for being the first to step out and say it. I've lived in the city of Boston my whole life, so I can totally envision what could be based on this decision. And I'm really trying to think about the kids and like, what's the best decision for the kids? And if this doesn't pass tomorrow night at school committee and we revert back to an old plan, it's bad. It's bad for our kids. If this just continues to drag out and be put off, it's bad for our kids. And I'm trying to envision what the consequences are if we don't go forward with the 2080, and I have no idea what that could be. But I can envision some things, but I think it would be bad for kids. And the reason I think it would be bad for kids is I've never met two better advocates for kids in the city of Boston than Mr. Contenpasas and Ms. Sullivan. And so it's not really the what. We put forward a 2080 in our plan this year. It's sort of the how this is happening that I'm trying to wrestle with. And that's how I'm trying to separate my feelings right now. I have the utmost respect for Mr. Chernow and Ms. Nagasawa. And when you are leaders of the city, I want to work for you. I just want to name that now, public comment, put it out there. The two of you are two of the most outstanding human beings I have ever worked with. And I love that you stand for what you believe in at all times. And I truly, truly, call me, I'm in. You two are amazing. And I look forward for you being future leaders in our city. With all that being said, I am going to vote yes for the 2080. And I'm doing that for the kids because I do, in the long term, when I think of the big picture, think that will be what's best for our kids.
Mr. Krager?
I'm just gonna take my hand down because anything I was gonna say wasn't gonna be half as good as what Ms. Grassa said. And I can.
Ms. Skerritt?
I share similar sentiments to any of my task force members. I'm just hopeful to Mr. Guerre's point that there has been a lot made of our opinions on this task force in relation to who we are and what we're about. And it's been a lot that's been placed on the shoulders of the task force for the last 60 hours over several months. And I do want to take a moment to recognize Mr. Chernow, and Ms. Nagasawa. But I'm concerned that are being asked to make the decision here while I understand it. I'm hopeful that that does not remove any other folks involved obligation to speak on this as well. I feel as if we have done considerable work in the absence of a larger opinion on what direction we should move in. And I do understand why it would make sense to go with one recommendation to the school committee. But I do think that our school and district leaders also need to support our decision or speak on our decision. It is difficult to make these decisions without knowing the position outside of this task force, as we are all vested members of the community. But as we can tell from this conversation, we are not the only members of this community that have opinions and thoughts about this process, understandably. And so it does feel all the more uncomfortable for us to be the last word here, as we've been the only word. And I just wanted to name that as being an additional challenge to this dialogue.
If I may, all of the comments that every one of you have made are respectful and respected. And I believe that people are hearing them. And both Ms. Sullivan and I deeply appreciate the kind words that you've said about us. We have tried, at least to the best of our ability, to share with you as much around the proposal that was made this evening as we can. I think you have heard from both of us how difficult it has been for us to move forward on this. And I understand the frustration. When I said this earlier, I said basically that there is a greater good here. And that greater good may be in jeopardy. And I would simply ask all of us, as difficult as this decision is, to recognize that Ms. Sullivan and I have not talked about this at length. But if we tell you that the students in this district need, the district needs to be supported to the best extent that it can be, if we are to move this district forward. We have told you as much as we possibly can. And we've also heard you and the frustration and the difficulty that you've shared with us. And I guess what I'm asking you all to do knowing that the information may still be unclear, that you put your trust in what Ms. Sullivan and I have tried to do this evening. I can't make it any clearer. Mr. Kroeger?
Yeah, I'm in, but I am gonna say this. I think the city asked a heck of a lot, first of the two of you as chairs, but all of us as task force members, to do all of this in full compliance with the open meeting laws, such that every single opportunity for deliberation we had to do publicly on Zoom, right? And for hours at a time, right? And to the extent that there are local elected officials who are weighing in here by doing it in quiet, right? Shame on them, right? And shame on them for playing Boston politics in a way that doesn't break open meetings law, but in a way that puts all of it on our backs. That disgusts me. And I hope that for any of them who are listening tonight, that they heed Ms. Sullivan's words, that this is it, right? That I'm willing to bend here because we want to see this get done. And to be honest, right, at least in terms of a simulation, there's very little difference between an 80-20 and a 100% tier rec, right? So I don't get what the impetus for the push is, right? But I do know that what we've done is move the needle substantially. And I see that whatever way we apportion these seats. And so I'm in. But I think it just needs to be on the record that you can't ask folks to do this, giving up their work time, their family time, their personal time for this damn long in front of this many people over Zoom, subject to whatever Twitter storms we are, and then play Boston politics on us in this way and expect us to feel good about it. And that's a message not for our co-chairs. That's a message for our supposedly publicly elected leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Krager. Ms. Lum?
I want to be clear about what we're debating here. Just again, is last night's consensus agreement, not vote or not official, completely off the table? This is now an either 80-20 model as discussed, or nothing. I'm just trying to get a sense of, or put in another way to Mr. Kreger's earlier comment, what if we did the 100% tier consensus proposal that we had last night? What is the ramification of that versus putting forth an 80-20 proposal by vote?
The ramification is something that I believe Ms. Sullivan and I would not like to see. And so I guess we've reached a point where we have to make a decision on the recommendation to the superintendent and the school committee that we presented this evening. And I'm not sure that those of you that have raised an objection have changed your mind in any way, shape, or form. So at least this co-chair is at a point where if we do not have consensus, then we are in a position where we have to take a vote. And I would suggest and apologize in advance. I have not been clear to the point, I have been clear to the point that I feel comfortable being clear. And I think if that still results in 3 or 4 of you or more turning this down, that's the recommendation that we're going to put forward. And as I've said, I think on 2 different occasions, the ramifications from that will not be pleasant. So Ms. Sullivan, anything
I want
to
to, yes, I do have something. So look, this is heavy, and I deeply appreciate that, you know, part of this ask, it's hard to respond to the ask because, you know, we don't all have we're not all there, we all still have some questions, right? So I understand that. This is what I will say. As hard as it might be, let's put our rigorous debate and dialogue and consensus building of yesterday to the side for a minute. Okay. And let's take out kind of the external factors, the external noise that is currently in the space. And I want to ask you to think about our charge and think about this recommendation 70-30 with the 80-20 on the mechanism. And the question is, does that policy or would that policy help us to achieve the charge that was set before us? And if it does, for you, it's a personal question. If it does for you help us to meet the charge, then my ask is that you ask us to present it to the school committee or to the superintendent to be presented to the school committee for their vote. I'm not asking you to agree to the policy recommendation. I'm asking that you would allow us to present it to the school committee on behalf of the task force. It's a different question. And I'm going to add this on here. You all already know, I am absolutely comfortable making it very clear, you know, that as a task force, we weighed between these two. I'm not getting into the whole universe, but that we weighed between these two, and that it was not an easy decision. Miss, oh, I thought I saw a hand. Responses to that? Ms. Aguirre.
It is a different question, I agree. And I think that this is better than what we have been doing, that advances our goal and is good. It's not as good as it could be, but it's good. So it will kind of somehow match our chart. But I think that I will ask that we also kind of on the record say that we are not comfortable with the way with the pressure that has been put on us. And I would really ask to have that on the record, that we are, as Mr. Gregor say, I mean, I think that it has been disgusting. And I mean, I will not put it like that on the record, but I would like on the record that we really don't agree with this last minute political pressure on the task force.
Are there any other responses?
It looks like maybe Mr. Acevedo.
First of all, Ms. Sullivan, kudos, especially at this late hour, for summoning the presence of mind and the legal acumen to rephrase it in that way. As what I said at the beginning is that I was hoping for permission in this complicated town that many of y'all know much better than I do, to do right, as Ms. Grasso said earlier, by our kids. And if this is going to get us permission, if what we are facing, and you, Mr. Contenpasas, must know you're being, I think, wisely guarded, but what we are facing is a zero sum between not advancing the work of this task force and meeting our charge. And doing so, albeit imperfectly, I prefer that we get permission to do right by our kids. And it's fine if we do it under protest.
Dr. Tung?
So I'm trying to answer Ms. Sullivan's question. I don't agree to the policy. I don't, we all agreed last night, so I don't agree to the pressure. If we were to vote and I was in the minority, it would still be presented to the school committee. So the term allow it to be presented to the school committee, you know, I don't feel like I have the power to stand in the way of that. I would ask that any of us who want to share our dissenting opinion tomorrow night at the school committee be allowed to do so.
I guess what I would suggest is that we convey that, and Ms. Sullivan, you may have a different point of view, that we convey that to the superintendent.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, I concur. So to close this out, are there any others who would like to speak in opposition to us presenting this tomorrow? Mr. Trina.
I also would object to it for similar reasons that I've mentioned throughout this meeting, as well as in previous meetings. To me, it feels like consensus doesn't matter anymore because the opinions of those not in this task force have overpowered the opinions of the groups of our group, and they are now driving our decisions. So I don't really see how, I think from the looks of it now, it looks like majority will still continue to support it. So I don't know what consensus else adds to that conversation. So I don't really have a problem with being a part of the minority dissenting opinion.
Yes, I understand that my dissent is symbolic, but I will continue to dissent. And I respect that this is going to be the recommendation, and I do think it will be a step forward, but for the record, I do want to be opposed.
Okay.
And my opinion is as it was.
Okay. So with that, what I would like to do is, thank you. What I would like to do is we will make this recommendation, we'll present this recommendation. We will also look for an opportunity. Mr. Condon Passes, we will look for an opportunity for there to be some sort of statement capturing the objections that have been made, the concerns that have been raised. And I also think it will be important for us to make very clear tomorrow, all the ways, quite frankly, in which, the process notwithstanding, all the ways in which the recommendation in total exceeds the charge, will help our district and these schools move in our city, move forward toward greater inclusion and opportunity. But I think that's Mr. Condon Passes. That would be, again, I think the most fair and representative thing to do would be to include in our presentation some of the objections that we've heard tonight. And we'll figure out how to do that. Is everyone planning to attend tomorrow? Yes, 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 yes. Okay. All right.
I would concur with what you just said.
Okay.
So I never know what to say when we reach
A
I think
decision, a decision.
that means that we have probably completed our task. And Ms. Sullivan, at the beginning of this conversation, wanted to thank you, or said thank you to all of you. This has by no means been an easy process. I hope in the future that when the school department puts a task force together, that it won't be one that has to deal with as timely, important, but also time-consuming process as this one has been. So I, for one, want to thank you for putting in the time, for having the courage to suggest how we could improve what indeed for a number of years has needed improvement. And as has been said, this is by no means the end. And I would ask all of you to remain vigilant, to see to it that the work that we have done and the recommendations we make in total are sustained and improved upon, because it's the right thing to do. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Sullivan.
I have nothing to add, nothing more to add. We have,
We can go to public comment.
I do believe we can go to public comment.
Ms. Parvik.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kondopasis and Ms. Sullivan. We have 2 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. I would remind you when you have 20 seconds left. Please state your name and what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. I will move you up as a panelist, and we will ask to turn you to turn on your camera for public comment. Our first speaker this evening is Mimi Lai. Please unmute yourself and turn on.
My name is Mimi and I live in Rosendale and I will be a Henry Group parent.
Sorry, excuse me. Can you turn on your camera?
Oh.
Thank you.
My name is Mimi and I live in Rosendale and I will be a Henry Group parent. I was raised by a single mother who was a Vietnamese war refugee, and BLS was life-changing. When I was 11 years old, I desperately wanted to escape my cockroach-infested public housing apartment. My mother would come home exhausted after a long day of scrubbing motel toilets. But I dare not tell her about my stress. So every night for months, as I waited for my high school assignment, I would quietly stare at my ceiling and hoped and pray that I had studied enough, trying to quell my fears about the future. Deep down inside, I knew that no one was going to help rescue me but me. Putting myself back into that dark place, if you had told me that I had no control and my fate was left up to a lottery, a random chance, and my seat access was heavily limited, I would have been beyond stressed and inconsolable. On the other hand, if you did the following, I would think, wow, someone is looking out for me. Thank you for giving extra points for attending a high school. a high poverty school. Thank you for giving extra points for families living in Boston Housing Authority projects. Thank you for adjusting the weight of grades in the exam to be 70-30. These are all excellent moves toward equity. I would have been especially grateful and relieved if you had put me in a Chicago-style socioeconomic tier, so I would have been competing with children of similar backgrounds. But honestly, it would have reduced my anxiety if I thought I'd had access to more seats. The Chicago model had 4 tiers and a larger citywide percentage. So families would theoretically have access to 47% of the seats, no matter which tier they were in. In the Boston version of a citywide with a citywide option, families would feel like they have 30% access, not just 12.5. Look, you're so close. I know you're frustrated, but please don't die on the hill over the 2080 option. I spent 2 days pouring my heart out over that testimony because I sincerely care about the children in the city. If it seemed to arrive late, it was because I had agreed with almost everything you have been working on for the last few months. So please, you're so close. I really appreciate everything you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Cindy Tower Lowen. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera. You're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Tower Lowen. I am an activist. I do not live in Boston. I live on the North Shore. I have attended many of these meetings. I spoke in one meeting prior. What I watched tonight, I think, was the first time that I actually saw faces that were frustrated, because last night there was consensus. There was so much that you guys had worked on for 60 hours plus. And yet today you had to change that. And maybe I should back up and say, you chose to change that given what came out within the last 24 hours and probably has been there the whole time, but just obviously waited until the nth hour. The Boston politics, the whiteness, which obviously I can speak to that. The fear of change, taking something away from others that they feel that they are entitled to. All of those things have played out. I want to thank the task force for the integrity and the value that you brought to the task force. I wish that you guys could have gone forward with where you were last night, because you were not able to do something by consensus. And that was one of the things that I believe both of the chairs wanted, and especially Mr. C had wanted to, when I say that, he consistently said, if we have to, we'll take a vote. But he did not want to take a vote. He wanted consensus. And so here we are tonight. And unfortunately, I wish that everything that you guys worked for was able to continue in terms of last night and today. And I want to thank everyone else that stuck with this and had things said to them, emails, etc. And I also want to hold up the Boston NAACP, because I do know that they have been instrumental in terms of changing the narrative in Boston. Thank you very much and good luck for everything you've done.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sullivan and Mr. Kondopassis, that concludes our speakers for tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Parvex. Appreciate that. So this might be our last meeting. It's the last meeting on the calendar, but it might be our last meeting. So I do want to, I do realize that the hour is late, but I do want to give folks an opportunity, you know, 1 to 2 minutes, if there's anything you'd like to say as we close out this work, just once around the room. Miss Lum.
I just wanted on the record that we had consensus and consensus was taken away from us. That is what happened. And I think it has made this evening fairly challenging for me, and I'm still not sure how I will vote. I thought we had both options still on the table, but it's been made very clear that both options are no longer on the table and it's just the one. So I am still deliberating, but again, it is because it has been removed or consensus has been taken away, not that it wasn't reached.
Okay. All right. So, Dr. Tung.
I guess I just wanted to take the opportunity to share with my fellow task force members some of the framework that I've been operating on. And I'm not talking about what happened in the last 24 hours. I just really respect you all. And I guess I feel the need to be understood about some of my positions. So if I could have a minute, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
All familiar with the graphics about equality and equity that show higher ladders for smaller people to see the ball game over the fence. And this task force, even with the 20% citywide, is landing on a recommendation that increases equity by building more ladders. And we need both equity and justice solutions. And there is a difference in my mind. So equity solutions address access and opportunity, while justice solutions address the root cause of inequity, so that fewer incremental equity solutions need to be created in the first place. Those who want to maintain the tiered tracked system in BPS believe that equity can be achieved by providing higher ladders for those not born white or with educated parents or with parents who have higher incomes. And so to minimize the harm going forward, we have had the opportunity to do away with the structures that cause inequity. Those of us who want to do away with the tiers and the tracks in BPS believe that it's more important for everyone to be able to see through or over the fence. Because we know from history how long justice takes, I've been pushing for greater and more rapid change, like being test blind or using a lottery for admission, and certainly no set aside for the powerful. The urgency to improve all schools in Boston demands that we fix the structure, which is tracking and tiering that permanently separates some children from others within and across schools. Equity and justice are not mutually exclusive. It's more difficult to fix the structural problem than to create new programs or equity solutions. But in the long run, equity will be elusive without justice. that's why I would support any recommendation that included either no test or a lottery or both. The other options improve upon equity, but maintain the root cause of injustice. Thank you.
You, Dr. Tung. Anyone else? Mr. Chernow.
Well, I wanted to start by saying it's been an honor to be on this task force with everyone. I'm not really sure how I ended up here. Came a little late to the crew, but it's been interesting, and I'll never forget what I have learned and gone through in this task force. I did want to be transparent in saying that I was not on board fully with last night's plan. So I know people have been saying there's been 100% consensus, but I don't want to be out here lying to everyone and saying that I was fully in agreement with the plan before less than 24 hours. I had spent a lot of time thinking that past weekend and stuff, and really for me was like, I had to remember that I'm a Boston Student Advisory Council representative, and that's why I'm here. So my first priority are the students and high school students that I was, not anymore, and that I worked with every day from every high school across the district. So as Dr. Tung had already mentioned, I've kind of spoken on it since I've been on here about the issues with testing and how it fits in the glove of systemic oppression and racism in this country, that it goes beyond just the school system. And we don't need to have that conversation. We've had plenty of those already, but I just wanted to say that as much as I would have valued consensus and the importance to hold, I was not able in good conscience to support either tonight's or last night's. But again, I wanted to still also say I enjoyed this experience with everyone and appreciate the dialogue and the learning experience that this has brought me.
We appreciate having the opportunity to work with you, sir.
I would add as well, if I may, that we not only wish them well as they move on, but we expect them to study hard, have fun, and make sure that they make the dean's list.
I'll make sure to remember that.
Okay. I promise you I won't check. Is there anything else to come before the group?
Mr. Kreger.
Just want to offer my sincere thanks first to you both as co-chairs to navigate us through this tumultuous public process. And my huge thanks to my colleagues who have been at this for far too long, and the great pleasure I've taken in learning from you. And finally, my huge thanks to Ms. Parvex and to all the interpreters who have steadily kept this moving so that everyone in our city could access this at all times. And I am so grateful that that ethic is present here.
Wonderful, thank you. Any others? Okay, well, I was just gonna give again, thank you to the task force members. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your thought partnership. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your commitment to our children, most importantly, and to our city as a whole. Again, I also want to echo the thanks to our interpreters, and I want to also thank Ms. Parvex, Monica Hogan, and Monica Roberts as well, for their support on this task with the task force work, and also the BPDA, because as we started to get really deep into the weeds on the data, the BPDA also provided some additional support in the background that was incredibly helpful. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. I do believe that We have done good work here. And I hope that it can serve in some way as a catalyst for the additional work that must happen in the BPS, so that we can have a different conversation going forward. So that for me is the fight that I will continue to fight. And that's for really not just the 1,100 seats, but for the 50,000+ seats that are in this district. Thank you all for being on this journey with us. Mr. Condompasis.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Well said. If there's nothing further, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a motion, please? May I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion or objection to the motion? Hearing none, Ms. Parvex, please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Condompasis. Mr. Acevedo,
Aye.
Ms. Aguirre,
Yes.
Mr. Chernow,
Yes.
Mr. Prager, Dr. Freeman Wisdom,
Yes.
Ms. Grassa,
Yes.
Ms. Lam,
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Garrett,
Yes.
Dr. Tang,
Yes.
Ms. Wade,
Yes.
Ms. Sullivan,
Yes.
and Mr. Condompasis.
Yes. Meeting is adjourned, and thank you all.
Good night.